Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Loren Schoenberg, and I'm the executive director of the Jazz Museum in Harlem. And I'd like to thank you all so much for coming this evening. A couple of words about what we're about. If this is your first time here, we're going into our third year with our offices in Harlem. We're currently working towards attaining a site, a major site up here, to actually build the Jazz Museum in Harlem. But in the meantime, we've been doing a lot of programming, a lot of events. And if you go to our website, which just happens to be on the bumper sticker, it just happens to be on your seat, which says "Save the Jazz Museum in Harlem with $1." You get our website address, and there's a lot of information on the bumper sticker, I should say on the website, as to what we're about. I'd like to introduce our staff and our family here. We've already met invaluable to us, Miss Wilhelmina Grant, our executive assistant, and many, many other things. We all do a little bit of each other's job at this place. My co-producer for the series, who's also the editor of Harlem World, Mr. Greg Thomas is here. And especially like to acknowledge the presence this evening of the George Washington of our project, because George Washington isn't alive anymore. Mr. Garment is very, very much here. The man who really gave birth to the Jazz Museum in Harlem and continues to be the chairman of our board of directors, Mr. Leonard Garment, is here. And all I can tell you is that I've been looking forward to this evening's talk for a long time. There's many times people view history and view the arts and the creative arts through very narrow vantage points, in which we think of music over here, and we think of architecture over here, and we think of painting over here, and we think of sculpture over here. And my guest this evening is someone who's managed to unify all these different aesthetics and worlds through his own work, whether it's from the Schoenberg Center, or to Ghana, or to Paris, and now to the World Trade Center. Max Bond has made his vision something internationally felt, and will continue to as his current work continues. So it's my great pleasure to introduce a legend, Mr. Max Bond. We're going to improvise. After all, this is a jazz event, but Mr. Bond has been kind enough to bring some images, and so we're going to just go back and forth here, and I turn it over to Max Bond.
Max is fine. Thank you.
I'm going to give you this one.
Okay. Loren, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here. I too have been looking forward to this evening, of course, with a lot of trepidation, because architects are not musicians really, although music has obviously influenced me very much. Just a little bit of personal history to start with. I grew up in the South, and then went to school in the North, and traveled a lot because my parents worked lived abroad. So I've spent some time in Europe and Africa, in the Caribbean, and I thought I'd start with these two slides. Piano lesson by on the left by Matisse, 1916, and on the right the piano lesson Romer Bearden by 1983. And the reason for starting with that was that as a kid in Tuskegee, I took piano lessons. But there, every time you'd make a mistake in this terribly overheated, big old building, they'd rap you across the knuckles with a ruler. So I really never learned to play the piano. But it did pique some sort of interest in music, and so really throughout my life, I've remained very interested in music, and I wish I had a teacher as caring as the one in the Romer Bearden slide on the right, who really seems to be caring about the student. As growing up in the South, there was always this issue of who you were, what your culture was, and that there was this great sophisticated world out beyond where we lived. And so I'd spend my summers in Louisville, where my grandparents lived, we were living either in Atlanta or Tuskegee or in Haiti. And my cousins in Louisville were very, very hip and sophisticated, so we listened to jazz, and that was one of the ways that we kind of, as teenagers, set ourselves apart from the crowd. And there was one of our group was a guy named Ted Jones, spelled in Jones, who moved to New York, became a beat poet, changed the spelling to Jons. But anyway, and jazz was sort of, to us, a symbol of who we were and part really of our identity. Later, years later, I was traveling in Tunisia, and one day walking in Sidi Bou Said, I heard sort of over the whitewashed walls of this town, Miles Davis tune playing, and then later to the Fulbright grant in Paris, I used to go to a place called Le Chaquipeche, and there one would see all the sort of famous musicians of the day. And I was a student, not a lot of money, and we'd sort of sit and admire these very elegant people. I remember one night Max Roach was there and looking elegant as always, and sort of we felt particularly shabby, but again, it was this sort of sense of sophistication and that you get in this painting by David Driscoll that we got in looking at the feeling of jazz and the sort of association with it. And of course, at that time, there were also in the movies. There was the movie L'Ascenseur pour l'Échafaud, Elevator for the Scaffold, I think, with Jean Moreau, and Miles Davis did the music for it with a French saxophonist, Barney Willen, and it's really just wonderful music. And so that too was then part of being a young man in France, and again, sort of feeling some sort of tie to those things, and that really made me realize that the extent to which jazz has influenced 20th century culture, the arts. And so throughout, and that's why I'm really showing all these paintings, and as Loren mentioned, in architecture and all of the arts, you really get a sense that jazz has affected them all and changed the sensibility. And so people in the arts and painting have tried to find ways of representing that. And as well as in architecture, the rhythm of jazz, trying to visualize rhythm, trying to visualize syncopation, which you see very much in Mondrian's work, and also in learning, as one gets in jazz, to sort of that all culture has meaning, that it is also about identity and establishing one's identity. So Picasso and the three musicians, again, as in a lot of his work, you see this sort of cultural fusion. Not only is he representing the music, but also he's drawing on African art and a variety of things, as well as abstract European composition. And of course, there's a famous Broadway Boogie Woogie of 1942, Mondrian, which is cool and all, and yet very syncopated. And this painting, for me, like various recordings of Miles Davis and, say, Abdullah Ibrahim and others, which really speaks of the city, coming to the city, being in the city, the grids of the city, the transportation even. I sort of see this in some ways as indicating a sense of transportation, of movement, and also then of the tensions of life in the city. And so I think one of the things that you can get in jazz, and Len and I were talking about it before, is a history. You can get the sort of history of the culture, of its evolution, of people through the music. And so to me, always listening to some of Miles Davis's tunes, that great group that he had, is very much about the transition of life, urbanization, life of the city, the movement of the city, the tensions of urban life. And of course, again, Romer Bearden, where you get all of this sort of fusion statement about the instruments, about the music and its effect, and a very dynamic composition and color at the same time. And then now a little bit of some of the work I've done. This is a library that I did in Bolgatanga in Ghana, northern Ghana. Jean, my wife, and I lived there for 4 years, and during that time, Kwame Krieble was the president, and he was very interested in literacy, and so they were building libraries throughout the various. There was a library to be built in each region of the country, and in this one, tried to do several things. One, to really represent, to capture some of the elements of the traditional village architecture, which is always where every major function is stated as an individual space, and also to deal with issues of the climate, thus this big sort of parasol roof over the little buildings that are set under it, and yet deal with the issues of a modern library, which were not part of the tradition. And I feel in that sense this building is like jazz in that it represents a kind of fusion of various cultural elements and in this case the African tradition and modernism and the changes that were happening and are happening in Africa as cultures modernize, people urbanize, and so forth. In terms of the composition of the building, I tried to set out a very kind of regular grid and a frame which is defined by the roof of the building, and then have a sort of free composition of elements within that, creating courtyards and every now and then something like the auditorium breaking out of it. And the auditorium was very important in this library because the idea was that people who couldn't read in the villages could come to the library, be read to, and thus learn about the importance of books and literature. These are some dormitories in Mississippi at Mary Holmes College. Mary Holmes College was very much involved in the civil rights movement, and so we were sort of hired by some of the people who've been involved in the movement to build these dormitories on this campus. And I show this because to us it was a very important building in trying to deal in some way within our terms with some of the cultural and political issues being in rural, next to a small town in Mississippi. And the small town was still pretty hostile towards the college. So we designed a building where we tried to create a very strong sense of community. And so if you look at the plan, I can't really indicate, but if you look at the plan, there are these sort of units that are sort of almost H-shaped, and each one is a group of rooms around a living room, a public room. And the idea was that that public room could be used for a variety of purposes, for seminars, for classrooms, or even subdivided, so that you would have not only people living there, but the opportunity for education in the midst of the dormitory, and the sense of a community. Then each of these little groups is linked to form a larger community. And so that the idea was to give people a certain amount of choice of association within this network of rooms. And then finally, unlike a lot of architects, at that point, a lot of architects were being praised for designing everything down to the last detail. We didn't feel that was appropriate. So in fact, we took another stance, and that was to not design, we just designed the room, a square room, 16 feet square, and then the students could pick their own furniture. And by doing that, we were able to go to a local woodworking cooperative that had been formed by some people. And we got a grant, helped them get a grant from the Ford Foundation to capitalize making the furniture for the students. So by pulling that out as a separate thing, we were able to get someone else involved in a new business. And it also meant, that the students could go and pick their own furniture and thus arrange their rooms in any way they wanted. And so it was, to us, a statement about freedom of choice in how you fixed up your room, or you could say it's a statement about improvisation if you wished. This is the King Center in Atlanta, where Dr. King is buried. And again, we were trying to deal very much with issues of meaning and of the way people built, so that we used the brick is from Georgia, the wood is either from Georgia or from West Africa, so we chose materials that would provide a kind of link to his heritage. And the King family was very insistent that the materials not be huge, very fancy materials. So there's very little marble or fancy, what they viewed as fancy materials. They wanted it to be a building of the people. And also, we tried to find a scale building that would not be intimidating, that would on the one hand state something about the importance of Dr. King and the movement, but not be intimidating to people. And the pool is there that in the center of the composition, which is meant to represent the continuity of the movement, even though Dr. King had been assassinated. And so there were other ways in which we tried to use the architecture to talk about meaning. And I show this because one of the things that we've tried to do, and I think that has been, for me at least, a very important component of jazz, is the issue of meaning. For my generation, John Coltrane was in the movement. You listened and you felt the aspirations of people for freedom in his music. Or if you listen to, as I mentioned before, Abdullah Ibrahim, or if you remember when Hugh Masekela did the piece when just at the Liberation about seeing Nelson Mandela walking out with, in the first version, Winnie Mandela. He later changed it into the favorite. But there's always been this, in my mind, this idea that music had content, had meaning, and spoke to cultural issues. And that's important because I think establishing one's identity is done very much through culture. And that's why when people colonize another people, they bring their language, their religion, and all of those things to change the identity of people. And so jazz and music were, for me, a part of creating and establishing an identity. And musicians like, as I mentioned, Coltrane, Ellington before him, and all really spoke to that kind of issue. I'll go through. And another composition by Mondrian. And this is important because, again, there's a kind of very clear statement of a field, and then within that, this sort of randomness. And I think this suggests, again, the idea that you can set up an order of things, and like in music, and then improvise and vary within that. And we tried to do that at this dormitory for NYU on 14th Street, where the facade of the building on 14th Street is actually quite orderly, but the windows are placed in sort of random and free ways within that. Or again, at this library in Queens, the 19th Use Community Library, where the windows are sort of done in a fairly random pattern, but within a sort of horizontal, an ordering system of the brick. And another thing we wanted to do here was to really make sure that people knew who Langston Hughes was. So we put a picture of Mr. Hughes on the facade and sort of engraving with a quotation so that the kids, even a passerby, would have a sense of who this building was about and what it was for. And then finally on the street, one of the things we did with this big window that you see in the street is to put sort of chairs there so that kids could come and sit. And what happened was that in the morning, elderly people come, sit, read the newspapers, and watch the street go by. At the end of the day, the kids, when they get out of school, come by and sit and use the building so that it sort of changes. And this, instead of the people looking in to see a show window, they're in the show window, really looking out at the world. Mondrian again, a sort of what I call a free grid, which is something that we tried to use in the Harvard Club that we finished on 44th Street here in Manhattan, where we took the idea of the solids and voids of the original McKim and White building and then overlaid this sort of grid on them and translated it then into the sort of gridded facade. So the building, on the one hand, we feel is really representative of the historical buildings, on the other hand, of another approach to the expression of facades and proportion and architecture. And then this is a project we're working on now in Chicago, back to Ghana, because the facade is inspired by the patterns of kente cloth. But again, I wanted to make this point about this expression of fusion, West Africa and Afro-America meeting on the streets of Chicago. And then last, a building that we just finished nearby on 125th Street, the Harlem Children's Zone, where again we tried to use transparency at the street level, color, and set against a fairly orderly facade to express the purposes of the building, that it was a school, community building. And Richard Franklin here also worked on this building with me and helped to solve a lot of the problems as we went forward. And so that's really all I wanted to show about our work. And of course, just to end with from Matisse's jazz series, there's this wonderful small book called Jazz, which is these Matisse collages. And I have always viewed this as a kind of a metaphor for what I've really been talking about, for art and for jazz and art as universal expressions of at least my generation and my century. So,
Thank you, Mr. Bosch.
Terrific.
I have to say, this is the print that we had in our office for a long time between Len's desk and mine. Is this next to a picture of Louis Armstrong with his arms stretched out? So I think we'll bring it up here.
oh, there it is.
Let's see to have it here.
Look at that.
Oh,
And behind door number 3.
well,
I'll just leave it there for the time being.
perfect.
Photographer.
There's so much to talk about, and so many questions to ask you. A brief view. It's okay. A brief view of Mr. Bond's,
Please, Max.
of Max's. Okay, if you want to say of Max's life story resume. I remember reading an article in the Washington Post, I guess about a year ago or 6 months ago. It was a wonderful interview. A story that begins with things that would be enough for one whole evening at the Jazz Museum, which is Tuskegee to Harvard. That's one evening. Or Le Corbusier, that's another talk. Or about your feelings about, even some quotes I've read about your feeling about the housing up here in Harlem, and about how it should reflect senses of ownership by people in certain communities where people are not made to feel as though they own something. But I'd like to begin just kind of just pulling one out of the 1,000 things I was thinking looking at your work, was the relatively horizontal structure that you did in Ghana.
Yes,
And-
the library, yes.
Right. And I was wondering about the definition of an American idiom in architecture. I'm wondering if it's possible to say that something like Frank Lloyd Wright, what your thoughts are about Wright coming out of his work with Louis Sullivan, and how he defined what an American idiom, what is an American idiom in architecture in the world that you came into, and how did you feel that what did you want to bring to it? Did you see anything lacking, or was it something that needed to be added to?
Well, first of all, on Frank Lloyd Wright, yes, I think that he did express a lot about American culture, a particular view of it, and which is, I think, very much tied to his roots in the Midwest, and to, again, this question, which remains still very much a question in American architecture, of urbanism and our relationship to the urban environment. And so I think that though he trained with Louis Sullivan, who I think actually did wonderful urban buildings, I don't think Frank Lloyd Wright was nearly as comfortable with urbanism as, say, Sullivan, and I think you can see that in a lot of his work. And so I think that one of the things that's really an issue for American architecture and American sense of architecture is our sense of the urban environment, of buildings in the urban environment. And we still, in architecture, I think very much of what is ultimately a kind of suburban mentality. It's always the building as object, set free. And so we celebrate, to this day, the architects who do the great individual building that you can walk around on all 4 sides and see as this object. And yet the city, I think, is made up very differently. The city, for a city like New York, the building is not the individual building, but the block, or the 2 faces of a street. And so thus you get another kind of potential of another kind of language. For example, if you look at some of the blocks on the west side with the sort of series of brownstones and the stoops and all of that, you get some of the things that interest me: repetition, variation, rhythm, and all of those things. And so I think one of the things that American architecture has to do is to come to grips with urban expression. But I think that's true also even of a lot of architecture throughout the world, and particular difficulty of our time. And then finally, in terms of what I would aspire to, I think that an architectural language really comes from the interaction of various artists. I don't, for example, I think one of the issues with African American architects and architecture right now is that there are not enough of us practicing and doing buildings. I think that one of the things to me always again about jazz is that there was such a strong community of interaction. Guys were all these shifting groups. One week they'd have one group, and then next week he'd be leading a group, and then they'd play together or have jam sessions. And so there was a real community. And if you read about them talking about each other, hear them talking about each other's music, they're obviously listening to each other, learning, growing, and developing. And I think that doesn't happen enough. I think that the only way you really create a particular culture of architecture is through this kind of interaction. Now, we always pick out the stars. So we pick out Picasso, we pick out Miles Davis. But they're just really symbols of, I believe, a community of artists developing a language.
I know that you were at Columbia for many years, and there's a book called "The Beer Can by the Highway" by John Calvin-Hogan, and he looks at the downtown cityscape, at the New York skyline, and says, "Here's something that was never intended, building to building, to be any kind of unified whole, but nonetheless, when you look at the New York skyline, it's one of the most iconic images in the world." And I like to think of that in some sense as a jam session of architecture, that all these things just work side by side. Jumping back to one of the things that I mentioned before, I'd like to ask about your early years, about Tuskegee, where I believe your father taught,
Yes.
and about those days, and about what led up to going to Harvard, and how did that all come to pass?
All right. But first, let me go back to Kuenhoven. That's, to me, a fantastic reference that you made, because one of the, I think, the most important books for me is the book that he wrote called Art in America, Made in America, which is just a fabulous book and goes to your previous question about the creation of an American art. And one of the points that he makes in talking about artifacts and tools is that American tools were very practical, very direct, and that from that there's a kind of aesthetic. And that's actually something you answered your first question better than I did in terms of bringing up Kuenhoven, because I think that also speaks very much to a kind of American, the potential of an American aesthetic. Very direct, and you see that in, I think, some of the work of architects, a kind of very direct expression. Architecture is a funny field for understanding those things, but nevertheless, I think that's a very important book and a very important reference in terms of understanding the visual arts and in America. Tuskegee. Well, I guess one of the things that was true about my parents, particularly my father, was this sense of being of the world. In Ntozake Shange's play, she talks about the young woman, talking about a thing, says at one point, "I was in the world till I came to Harlem." I don't know the exact quote, but that's not the right quote. What's the quote?
I used to live in the world, now I live in
I used to live in the world, now I live in Harlem. Well, my father always wanted to live in the world. And so we were living in Tuskegee, but he was in the world. And so one of his great interests was Bucky Fuller. He was not an architect. My father was an educator, not an architect. So he was very interested in Buckminster Fuller and in those kinds of things. And also in what was going on in rural Alabama. So very often on the weekends, we'd drive out into the countryside and sort of look at these farms and houses that were built. And then finally, the Tuskegee Education Extension Program was building a house for teacher trainees, which my father designed, I think, and certainly was very much involved in building. And so we used to go out and watch the progress of this house being built. and I can still sort of remember the sighting of it. The other big thing for me, architecturally in Tuskegee, was that there were, it was built, the students built, designed and built a lot of the buildings, but there was a group of buildings which were industrial sheds, and they were a very regular kind of series of buildings. And I don't know whether I loved the buildings or the fact that they had fighter planes in the buildings, because they were the Tuskegee Airmen, so there were mechanics working on these P-40s and whatever the planes were, Bell Air Cobras. But the buildings it was very striking because they were very, very industrial, simple sort of buildings with very clean, clear spaces between them. And so, so to me, Tuskegee was important as a place where I first started thinking about buildings and architecture, not with the idea that I would be an architect, but these environments had such a very strong impact on me. And then this whole transition from Tuskegee to wherever. My parents worked at various other black colleges, and at one point for what is now the U.S. aid program, and so we lived in Haiti, and they were in Liberia for a while, and then came back and lived in Atlanta, and I went to Booker T. Washington High School, which at that point was there were two black high schools in Atlanta, and they each ran half-day programs, so you went either in the morning or the afternoon, and because of this sort of strange education I'd had living in various different places, I was placed in the way I was skipped ahead. So I graduated from there, I don't know, 13 or something, and then went to a school in the north for a couple of years, and then went to Harvard, I don't know. I mean, Harvard was a shocking experience. In my year, there were 1,100 freshmen and exactly 11 black freshmen, and that was true in the following year as well. And it was not the friendliest environment in the world.
What year, Max?
What year did
What
I go?
actual year?
Oh, before you were born. I mean, before time. Thanks,
That's
Ralph.
one.
I started in 1951.
Okay.
I was 16 years old
At Harvard.
at Harvard, and there I was. So graduated in '55, and in our freshman year, all the Harvard Yard at that point had dorms that were separated by price. So the cheap dorms were all in one corner of the yard, and most of the black students lived in the cheap dorm. So in the spring of my freshman year, some kids burnt a cross in front of our little corner of the yard, and so we decided to protest, and because nothing happened. If the cross was burnt, Harvard didn't react, nothing happened, and so we decided to protest, and we went to the Boston papers, and Boston Globe came out with banner headlines, cross burning at Harvard, and Harvard's reaction was to call us in and say they were going to kick us out for bringing bad publicity to Harvard. So we said, well, kick us out, we'll
Go back to the paper.
go back to the paper, and cause more trouble, getting our little selves together, these teenage boys. But anyway, it was kind of Harvard did eventually suspend the guys because they knew who had brought the cross. So they did suspend them for a semester, but it was not a friendly environment.
I understand there was also something for which I think ironic may be much too soft a word. When you were told when you were called aside at Harvard by a professor who told you kind of sotto voce to forget about being a black architect because, as I understand from the interview that I read with you, that there never had been one, and he was unaware of the fact that.
Yeah. Glad you said. Okay. No.
I'm not that kind of
Okay.
interviewer
All right. Well,
for the most part.
okay. It was you know,
Definition for the most part.
that's true. My first year of the design school, there was that sort of design guru in the GSD, the Graduate School of Design, and he was sort of the cop, I guess. So he did take me aside and say, "Mr. Bain, you seem like a bright young man, but there's never been any famous Negro architects at that point, and so why don't you pick another profession?" Ironically, and I'll get back to your reference, a few years later, he did the same thing to Dolores Hayden, who is now a very distinguished architect and professor at Yale. He took Dolores aside and said, "Miss Hayden, here's the routine." So that's why we called him the cop. But anyway, and this was ironic because clearly Widener Library on Harvard's campus, the big library, was designed by an African American architect working for a major Philadelphia firm, and so and there were, and obviously also at that very time, there was the architect Paul Williams working in California and doing houses for very famous people, and there was this, and then there was another architect in. Well, there were several black architects, obviously. The architects who had designed the buildings at Tuskegee, and this guy just had no knowledge of them, and even on the campus.
You mentioned before that right now, and you were president, was it the American Architects Association, AIA, was it? I have the acronym wrong, that you were recently president of or head of.
AIA.
I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects, a fellow of the American Institute of
And
Architects.
I read a quote where we talked about even now the presence of black architects in the field is extraordinarily low in terms of percentage numbers of
Yes.
that you were given. And so my question is, going back to the early 1950s at Harvard University, in the face of this reality that you've painted for us here, how did you go about feeling to be a member of a community? Where did you look for sustenance? Who were your peers? How did you go about surviving in that difficult environment?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it was, you had friends like everybody else, and there was this world out there. I think there was a very close knit group of us, and it was mixed, so black and white students. We had been friends, and we had something called the Harvard Society for Minority Rights, which we were very active in, and was affiliated as a youth chapter of the NAACP, and most of the people in that were actually close friends. So that was our little group, and we hung out together and used to go listen to music together, and spent our time. So there was that. It was the community in that sense. In the architecture school, there was not much of a similar community because the Harvard Graduate School of Design was not very friendly towards either women or students of color, as an example. So that in my first year in the Graduate School of Design, there were 4 other students of color, 2 African Americans, 2 Filipinos. They all got sort of washed out after the first year, and then most of the women also either got shifted out of architecture to landscape architecture. So the only ones who survived were Nancy Miao, Chinese American architect, and I, after the first year of the wonderful Graduate School of Design that particular year. So there wasn't much of a community in the architecture school, although one of my very close friends was a guy, became close for an odd reason. This one spring semester, the class decided to go to Bermuda. And at that point, in hotels in Bermuda, they wouldn't accept either blacks or Jews. So Mo Feingold and I, again, in process, the class went, but Mo and I became fast friends as a result of our little protest. even though we lost and the class still decided to go to Bermuda.
To shift to the realm of the aesthetic for a moment, as you're studying, when we talk to musicians, they always talk about their influences and who they studied with and what it was that turned them on about a style or a sound. What would the analogies be for you as a young architect studying, finding your own vision, and where did you look for inspiration? Were there buildings, were there architecture, were there things that really turned you on at that time that you wanted to emulate? And how did you head towards finding your own voice?
Well, as I said, I mean, the education at Harvard was so limited in terms of history of architecture and all of that. Really, the focus was on the sort of island of France, kind of in terms of the arts and visual things. And so I think that one of the important things for me was the summer of my second year in the graduate school, going to work for Paul Williams in Los Angeles. And he was very gracious. Jay Johnson, who was studying at Columbia, and I each wrote him a letter, and he hired us, these two young architects. So we drove out to California and worked for Paul Williams. And that was really inspirational. He made sure we got a lot of different experiences. And so I saw that, in fact, there was a world of architecture and people building that saw a kind of role model in that sense. But then going to having, as I mentioned before, having sort of lived in Tuskegee and this sort of sense of these sort of industrial buildings, and then going to North Africa because my parents at that point were living in Tunisia, was like a great awakening. So after having some education as an architect, to go to North Africa was just mind-blowing. I mean, I couldn't believe, and that's why I mentioned this place, Sidi Bou Said, these incredible towns in Tunisia and North Africa, and just the plastic nature of the architecture. And so,
May I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Not being a student of architecture, could you define for me what does plastic sense of architecture mean?
Well, the buildings were, built by people with limited means, and so they used a lot of vaults, mud vaults, and things. So the buildings had a roundness, a softness of form, and also, I think what is typical in places where there's very, very bright sunlight, you tend to get a softening of the forms and the corners because it produces a sort of contrast between a very sharp, hard corner and line. And so visually the buildings, and also a complexity of form. Every building, every building is sort of made up because people didn't have steel and big, strong structure. The spans are fairly small. So that, as I said before in talking about the library, each element of the building, each major room typically has its own roof, its own form, and you then get an accumulation of those. So the compositions tend to be additive, the residential compositions, and then the whole village is a sort of combination of these things. And often they're sited on sloping land because the flat land is used for farms. And so you get the traditional village in sort of North Africa. Everybody lives in the village, and the village is almost sort of held together by the spire of the mosque. It's almost as though it's a magnet holding it together within the walls. And then beyond that are lands that people farm. And that's also very true in Ghana, in the Sahel region of northern Ghana, that the composition of the villages is very much the same. People live, in effect, in towns and go out and farm in the land around them. There's another pattern there, too, where each little house is in the midst of its own farmland. But my point really is that you get always this sort of additive compositions, not a big dominating roof in one sort of thing.
When you answered that question, you use terms that I could almost be in a music analysis class. Some of these terms are exactly some of the same ones that we use in the conservatory or the jazz musicians will be using, as you're well aware from the paintings that you showed us. And my question to you is, for those non-architects of us, out there who admire your work. When you talk about composition, when you talk about rhythm, when you show the Mondrian and we talked about rhythm, can you explain to us from another world what we can see in architecture that would be redolent of rhythm? What's the analogy between rhythm and what you might sense in music and what you might see in Mondrian, and then how you might realize it in architecture? Because that's a mystery to a lot of us.
Oh gosh.
We
Well,
hear-
one of the things I would say is look at the shadows first. On New York streets, I think looking at the shadows is just incredible. For example, if you look at the stoops with the sun shining, there's a period in the every year when, because New York is slightly off north, where the sun sets absolutely right down these streets, and you get this sort of shadows and this sort of repetition of things. And so, and I think the shadows give it a kind of richness and complexity. And so that would be one way I would talk about it as sort of rhythm. I think another thing in the cities, and what I like so much about, obviously about cities and is that the streets have movement as well. So you don't look at a city street, architects always photograph the buildings as though they never any people there. But the truth is, when you look at any street, what enlivens it are the other things that exist beyond the buildings, the trees, so that again, the trees and their shadows, so that you get on the brownstone streets, for example, as I said, this repetition of stoops, windows, and then variation of trees, and the shadows of the trees, and then of movement, of people moving up and down those streets. And so it's really in that sense that you look at it not as a sort of static thing, but as a living and changing environment with light and movement.
Mrs.
Yeah, Louis Kahn.
That's just what I was thinking of. My architect in
Yeah,
India.
read the rhythm. You know.
I think that's
You
happening.
should
Yeah,
say
no.
something about
We said it.
Louis
No.
Kahn.
Louis Kahn's. Oh, yeah.
Relevant to
Okay.
his question.
No, it is, and that is the reference that Jean made to the film. My Architect speaks to that, and also even speaks to this what I said about the sort of shadows. But if you think of the Salk Center and the way that things are articulated, though, and I think there's a complexity: the concrete, the wood shutters, the windows, and so even though each one repeats, because you see them at an angle, you get a more complex sort of rhythm than just the simple repetition.
I have another question for you. And I guess it's asking you to react to what's become a cliche in between the musical arts and the arts of architecture. And that is this cliche. And I'm wondering whether there's anything to it. When they say that architecture is frozen music. That's one that one hears all the time. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, is there anything to it? Or is it just something that it just gets tossed around?
Well, it is a cliche, but I think it's actually an apt cliche. I don't think it's such a bad cliche.
Okay.
Because, and I think it has to do with the kinds of things I said. One, well, the issue of frozen. Maybe it's liquid. I'm not sure. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is, and that architects don't deal enough with, is the life of a building. In fact, buildings exist over time and are modified and change over time. So it's a very slow transition. But if you look at buildings, and one of the things that we've tried to do, and what I tried to talk about with the dormitory that we did at Mary Holmes College, is try to find a way of setting up a structure. In that case, a series of rooms, but with some variation that forms subgroupings. But then to try to find space for the people who are actually going to inhabit the building to change it, to modify it. So one of the things that we try to do is to have a different understanding of what the role of the architect is. I don't believe that in designing housing for people who we don't know, that we as architects should pick every color, design where everything should go. I think that we should try to find ways of designing much more open structures that allow people to come in and change them themselves. And so in that sense, again, if you could say that the architecture, that the basic architecture of a building is like the composition, which then people come in and interpret and alter and change and make their own. And that, just as an aside, that's the popularity of lofts. The reason everybody would like a loft and get it is because they can come in and change it, shape their own environment. And we as architects, and it's all an issue of power. We as architects think we have the power, particularly in designing housing for poor people, to come in and tell them how to live. But if you think about it, when you design an office building, nobody ever designs an office building and lays out all the rooms, because we know that the people who are going to move into an office building have power. And they then shape their own environment. So you design an office building like a loft, and you rent out so many square feet of space, and the tenants come in and they put in one big space, 10 offices, conference rooms, whatever they want. We really ought to do housing in very much the same way, and that would give a different sense of who's in control, who has the power in that situation.
I'd like to ask a question, when did you first come to Harlem? And then the follow-up question would be, when you first came to Harlem, and as an architect, how did it strike you, and how does it strike you now?
Well, actually, when I first came to Harlem, I was in school someplace, and I came and we stayed at the Harlem Y, my brother and I, on 135th Street.
Went to the shop?
And it was a mysterious but wonderful place. Later, I came back after living in, I finished architecture school, worked in France lived in France for a couple of years, and came back to New York, and lived in again, I guess it was still thought of as kind of Harlem. We lived in Central Park West and 104th Street. I shared an apartment with another architect. And what did I think of Harlem then? It was still, I think, for me, a fairly complicated place. This was in 63. It was interesting because there was a lot of ferment. There were a lot of people were really thinking about change, what should happen, and so intellectually and politically it was fascinating. In terms of the physical environment, it wasn't great. Even.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We're back with part 2 of our interview with Mr. Bain. And we were talking about so many interesting things. I was asking group about architecture and frozen architecture, etc. Just to jump back to a moment to the biography and where we left off at Harvard and your trips, these almost epiphanies that you had going to Africa and seeing things that were outside of that narrowly defined world of French architecture, of European aesthetic exclusive, to thinking of architecture as a fine art. When you talk about hearing these things in the music and expression of freedom and things in the 1960s. Oh, we were talking about and how you found Harlem, and that's the exact point that we dropped off at. We talked about, you were just saying about your experience of looking at Harlem from an architectural point of view, and how it struck you then. And if it's not too unnatural, I'd like to see if we can just start then, where we left off. And if not, then we'll just circle back around, because there's about 58 other things I'm dying to ask you. So. how Harlem struck you.
Yeah. As I said, I think that intellectually and in terms of just sort of ideas, the world of ideas, it was really very exciting. And that's Harlem and New York generally. And because it was a period where, on the one hand, for me, there was Harlem. On the other hand, there were a lot of people that I knew, Gene and I knew, who were involved in poetry and the arts, like on the Lower East Side, the Umbra poets, this guy I mentioned earlier, Ted Jones, who had now moved to New York, and so there was always this image. We go down to the East Village for their parties, and there was always somebody with a big pot of beans, sort of stirring, serve these beans or chili or whatever, cheap wine, but talk about everything and do everything. And then there were, every now and then they'd do a poetry reading coming up out of the village up to Harlem. And so it was, in that sense, an exciting time. And I have more of a sense of that than I do, frankly, of the architecture of Harlem at that time. I got much more involved in sort of thinking about the architecture of Harlem after I lived here from, as I say, from 62 till 61, rather, till 64, and then in Ghana from 64 until 68. When Gene and I came back, I started working for something called the Architecture Renewal Committee in Harlem. And what we were trying to do was to provide architectural services and planning services to people who otherwise couldn't afford them. And so then I got very much involved in the issues of architecture in Harlem, and at that point even of the real disinvestment that was taking place. I mean, this area where we are now had been really designated to become East Harlem, an industrial area. And so one of the things that we did at Arch, working with the Community Association of the East Harlem Triangle, led by that point, as is so typical, a woman, Alice Cornegay, who led it, we really got involved in doing an alternative plan which said that this area, East Harlem, could be more. It could be residential, it could have industrial and other uses. And so then, at that point in my life, I was very much involved in these kinds of issues about what Harlem might be, not as a community that everybody was fleeing, but as a community that could be regenerated.
Was there anything structurally in Harlem that reflected what you might define, or what we might define as an African-American aesthetic, or was it exclusively late 19th century faux this or faux that? I mean, I know that the building on this corner, across the street, the old Corn Exchange, I think is some kind of iconic structure, but it's nothing about it to me, with my not much of an eye for architecture, looks to say Harlem to me. Was there anything that said Harlem to you?
Well, not really. I mean, when Harlem, because Harlem was built mainly for white population and a fairly affluent. It was a population, most of Harlem. That's why the brownstones and all. So no, it didn't. And I think that in terms of the buildings, except at Christmas time, and there were at that point people would decorate the buildings much more. And so you finally got these awful, huge, dehumanizing projects. The buildings would dance with the Christmas lights, and people were used, there was a sort of period there where it was as though people were struggling desperately to find some way to change the environment, to affect it. And so what one had to look for in looking at Harlem and the buildings was not, at that point, I think, the buildings themselves, but what people were doing to them, either decorating them, painting. And I think to me, one of the wonderful examples of that is the mosque at 116th Street, which is an ordinary commercial building, and yet with just a few touches, the dome on the roof painted green with the minaret, the sort of arches that are placed in the square windows, just a few things suddenly change the character of the building, and suddenly you find people, and so what they did was to take just an ordinary commercial building, and with just these little things, state, we're here. This is, and give it identity. And so places either had meaning through gestures like that, or meaning because of what had taken place there, whether it's Minton's Cafe or the theater at the Schoenberg, in the original Schoenberg building, and the original Schoenberg building, or some of the other Carnegie libraries that are sort of scattered throughout Harlem, so that there was this combination of a few gestures and the few things that people had done to the built environment, but mainly this sense of history and of memory that gave the buildings their character.
I know that in the audience, there's a very interesting audience here this evening, and a wonderful one. I hope you'll all, again, consider yourselves members of our Jazz Museum family and come back. We have a very interesting mixture here this evening of people in the music business, people, architects, people in government, people, just all different kinds of folks here. And I would like to, at this point, open it up for questions. Because usually what happens is we talk, and then it gets to be, and then the landlord starts flashing the light, and then we do questions real quick, and then there's always three people who come up. I was dying to ask him about what he did at this place or that place. So at this point, almost 2/3 of the way through the interview, I'd like to open up to the floor for questions for Mr. Wright, and I'll ask you if you can to come up and say it on the microphone, so it's on the archive.
Hi, I have a question. I want to go back to your conversation about power in buildings and some of the decisions that are made for poor people. I'm a consultant in many different domains, and from time to time I worked in affordable housing. And I remember going to a site visit, the opening ribbon cutting of a building in Brooklyn, affordable housing built for low, moderate income families. And I was there with a group of clergy. And I missed this, what the clergy, this particular minister saw when we got into the living space. You know how dwelling units are divided into how many square feet you can have for a bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. And he looked to notice that when you look at that space, that would be assigned for, say, kitchen, eating, and living room, wasn't enough space for a dining room table or a kitchen table. Sort of compelling the people to eat on their laps or not be a family together. And I thought that was a certain kind of violence to the family, and I wanted to know whether or not you had ever made an observation like that, but I certainly did, and thought there ought to be, or my question is there any sort of conversation in your world, or in the world of design or thought, about family living that now opens that up, particularly for poor people, for whom family is such a big deal, or forming and maintaining family is such a big deal?
Well, I think those are very important issues, and they speak also to the fact that most affordable housing is designed as though there's a mother, a father, and two kids who never grow up. And you don't recognize that there are all kinds of other arrangements. So it's not only the dining table, which is a problem. These 8x8 kitchenette areas just aren't big enough for a family to dine. You're quite right, but it's just the whole idea of the way that the apartments are structured. And so there has been, again, more in Europe than here, a lot of experimentation with the idea of building housing, much like lofts, and renting it out, leasing it out, letting people buy it in terms of like lofts, and then fixing it up to suit their needs, because there are so many different potential family structures, and they change. And so there has been a lot of work on that. There's been very little of it built here. We did a study for Battery Park City where we tried to show that it would make sense, at least for one of their projects, to do it as this kind of loft housing. And there are several very compelling reasons for doing it. One, if people shape their own environment, the experience in Europe has shown that they're much happier, which deals with which, but also that they therefore stay longer, and that the buildings are better maintained. So there's less maintenance cost because the people stay, fix it up. The other thing is that you generally get a better environment because people, since they're building for themselves, will spend more of their discretionary money on their house, on their property. So instead of going out to dinner, they'll take the money and buy some paint or whatever instead of taking a vacation. And so there was a study done of loft housing in New York to look at the patterns. And what happened is the first year they buy it, people would not go on vacation, hardly go out to dinner. They'd spend all their money fixing up the apartment. The next year, and slowly but surely, they'd be more expansive and do more with their discretionary money. So it's been, so in terms of affordable housing, there's been very little done in this country, but yet obviously all around us for people of needs, thus people of power, you see all of these things happening. People lofts, or if you somebody buys an apartment in New York, there's a whole segment of our profession which modernizes, changes, adapts that apartment because those people have the means to do it. So it exists not as a sort of conscious, thought-out program that affects affordable people, but it exists throughout the world of architecture that people shape and change their own environment, and it's only the poor people who aren't allowed to do that. Everybody else does it and should do it, and we believe that everybody should be able to shape their own environment, even in a city, in apartment buildings.
Excuse me,
We just had a question. I'm sorry, yes, Mrs.
Loren, excuse me, I just wanted to add something to that because I thought that was really a wonderful question.
Yes.
I'm sorry for taking this license.
Yes, Dana, you take a question.
Sorry. Well, Max has he and I have frequently talked about this issue and I learned from him actually, being married to an architect, that the values that the society has very much influence what kind of housing is provided for people of spare means. And there was a time in the society when those values were somewhat different, and in those periods, you did get housing that had many more amenities, and this was housing for poor people. And the Harlem River houses, for example, were built in a time when there were different values that people held about what poor people deserved, in terms of how they lived. And I think we've lost that. So that and it's fallen off to the extent now that there really is such contempt, wouldn't you say, Max, for people who don't have a lot of money, that it's reflected in just the kind of thing that you observed in Brooklyn.
No, thanks. It's a good amendment, and even though I think that's true, New York is in many ways better than a lot of places. I mean, after all, during the Koch administration, New York City had a bigger program of affordable housing than the federal government.
Sir, you had a question.
Hi, I'm an architect from Nigeria, and I wanted to know if you saw any connection while you were in Ghana and Tunisia, any connection between the sounds you heard and the kind of architecture that you saw.
Sounds, smells, architecture. I suppose. Certainly for me, the sounds evoke the place. I mean, if you listen to Youssou N'Dour, for example, there's this tune Set, it's called. I mean, man, is that a better place? Certainly the idea of, the use of drums and of rhythm is very much, to me, evokes the place. Now maybe that's just a result of association, but I suspect it's probably more than that. I suspect that in fact places do generate, just as they generate styles of dress, ways of behaving, I suspect that they do generate musical forms that are related to the environment, because certainly each of these places speaks to it. And again, if you listen to, in West Africa, to the changes to the music that happens when people come to the city. And so if you go, we used to go to the Café de Ringway on the outskirts of Accra, where and the music was an urban music. It wasn't the music of the village, and I think you see that a lot in West African music of today. Again, this thing of how music changes as people move to the city, just as their lifestyle changes the way they work. I mean, one of the issues in architecture in the villages in Ghana, where I did the library, was that as people became a wage earner economy, they couldn't maintain their traditional architecture because the maintenance of it was very seasonal, based on the time. There was a time of the year to farm, a time of the year to maintain your house, to redo the roof, to replaster it. And similarly, I would imagine that there were times then when there were for musical celebrations or other things, which also then began to change as people urbanized, became wage earners, and different kinds of things. So I would imagine that that's true. I'm trying to improvise an answer.
You're swinging. I couldn't resist that one. Steve Haas over here, and then this gentleman.
Max, I continue to see buildings that are being designed, especially public buildings like performing arts spaces and museums, that are designed with bold expressions of architecture, both on the exterior and interior. And often these kind of buildings sacrifice the efficiency and the functionality on the inside to make these bold expressions, as well as the fact that they often are intimidating, especially when they're in urban environments, to the people who live and work around these buildings, because they sometimes clash so much with the surrounding environments, because they're perhaps, there are reasons that they were made with these expressions of architecture. And often I also see that in these public spaces, the cost to recoup the cost of the architecture that's being created here, the ticket prices end up being so expensive that often the people, again, who are around these buildings can't even afford to attend a lot of the performances because these, they're trying to recoup it. So what is your thought on that in general, and how in your practice do you balance the expression of architecture, the uniqueness of the architecture, with the functionality, just making the building comfortable for the people who visit it, as well as the people who actually work in it day to day?
Well, there are some famous architects who put institutions out of business by designing buildings that they couldn't afford. So yes, I think that if you're an institution that's working with an architect, needs to be very clear about their purposes and what they want. And too often, we as architects think of the building as our building, our chance to be famous and to make a great expression. And that's inevitable. I mean, there will always be architects who will fight very hard to make the building their expression. I think that what I guess I would say to that is what I've tried to do, and working with people I work with, is to, as I said before, to understand that any art is part of, that the artist does not exist as a sort of lone individual, despite Ayn Rand and the architects in there, but that you exist as part of a community. And that's a community of artists, a cultural community, social community, political community, and so you try to respect that. And in so doing, you hope that will then translate into the buildings that you design, but it takes away, to some degree, this idea of this creating this powerful, unique, individual expression. As I said before, I think there's also this issue of attitude towards cities, towards urbanism. We all admire Paris, but yet if you look at a lot of the streets and a lot of the buildings, they're very orderly, they're quite simple, and so then that the unique things become more important. So I think that building better cities, building better environments depends on the one hand, relating to the context and expressing it, but also trying to find that which is unique in the particular thing that you're dealing with. And also, I think very important, and this is often controversial, that you have to try to find an expression of your time. When we were working on the Harvard Club, next to two wonderful buildings, the original McKinley and White building of the Harvard Club and the Yacht Club, on the other side of it, we felt that we could not try to imitate either of those buildings. It was important for us to express our time, not only for aesthetic reasons, but also for technical reasons. Buildings work differently these days, air conditioning, but for a whole series of social and cultural reasons as well. When the Harvard Club was built, women weren't admitted. They could on occasion come into the club through a separate back entrance, up a little stair, and appear in the library where a shelf would open and they would pivot and they could step out. So when we got to work on the Harvard Club, there were not only the aesthetic issue, this question of it, but we had to, one of the things we had to do was to provide more bathrooms for women, except other than the ones that were in the basement. So they could have bathrooms. We had to make the building safer than it had been when it was originally built. And so this is kind of a long and funny answer to your question, but I think that if you look at buildings, then not only as aesthetic objects, but as representing a particular moment in time in terms of the culture, the technology, the sociology of the time, and you try to respond to those, I think that the building will then have greater resonance for the people who use it.
That could almost work transposed into a definition of what makes jazz work in its time. That's absolutely fascinating. We had some questions. Someone had a question. And then,
how you doing? I just wanted to get your opinion on the affordable housing projects that's going up in Harlem. Pretty much what you were saying before. More on a larger scale. Do you think it's good or bad that is the architecture identity of Harlem is being affected? Because if you look at the buildings, they all look typically the same. I know why, because of budget. Pretty much 80% brick, 20% drive-it. They all look, sliders with that little cutout for the AC units. Just for the architecture identity for Harlem, do you think it's affecting it? Yes or no?
What project were you referring to?
Within the 10-block radius from here, they all look the same.
The build projects.
They all look the same.
Well, you've answered the question by the way you pose it, and I agree with you.
Just the identity itself to Harlem.
The buildings are pretty bad. They're pretty terrible. And again, as I think we said here, and as my wife said, buildings really tell you about the values of the society and the culture. I mean, if you look at the heyday of the office buildings on Park Avenue, and I guess that was the 60s, they're telling you about corporate America and how important it is. Housing in our society, building housing for people, is not something that we give very high value to, and the buildings reflect that. And so these buildings are, I think, very ordinary, as you're saying, the private, the little hole in the wall for the air conditioning, and all of that. But they also do something that's even worse. Not only are they bad in that sense, but there's this sort of current thing of pandering to try to make them look historical, to make them look more important. So you get these plastic trim on them, you get a little small fake pediment, and all of those things. So because there's this idea that people in Harlem, and I've heard developers express it, they want the Harlem tradition, they want traditional work. So that there's hardly any new housing that you can find in Harlem that explores the kinds of things that we're talking about, that explores, I think, a deeper sense of what culture is and of this moment in time. So that all of these sort of strange, funny, sort of decorated buildings are just terrible. Trying to think of the right word.
Bend over here. And then we'll get back. That's all right.
Max, to go back to the music a little bit.
Could you introduce yourself, sir?
I'm Richard Franklin, an architect. I've worked with Max Bain. I've known him a number of years. I wonder if you talk a little bit about your work in regards to openness. The music has a tradition of being open. There's a tradition of jam sessions where anybody can come in. There's a tradition of final sets where a person can sit in who's an aspiring artist and wants to play. Your buildings have I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way you meet the street and some of the issues you try to involve yourself in terms of opening the building at the street level, some of the concepts you have. You touched on one when you talked about the library, but I think it went too fast.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I think that that is a very important point. And I give a couple of examples. One, the Harlem Children's Zone building, Krieble, which I mentioned is around the corner. As you walk along 125th Street, you can look in at the corner of Madison and 125th Street. We put the library, and we wanted the library there. They wanted the library there. Jeff Canada wanted so that the kids could have a sense of seeing the library and seeing people reading, using the building. And then as you walk west on 125th Street, you pass the entrance, and then there are windows to the gymnasium. Again, to give so people can look in, see what's going on in the building. We were there the other night at the opening, and former President Clinton spoke, and I looked up, and there were people just lining the window, all looking in and watching President Clinton, and it was like a little bit of an amphitheater. So I think that it's important, particularly in communities like Harlem, to give people a sense of what the building is about. We tried to do that very much with the Schoenberg years ago, so that there is on Lenox Avenue, as you go north-south, a very thin gallery, really about the half of the width of this room. And the idea was that the gallery was not only for people who came in and used the building, but that everybody walking up and down could look in and see exhibits. We also have, this is one of the sore points of my life, an octagon at the corner, an octagonal reading room, which you can look down into, and that you can take a shortcut on the corner between the exits there and the reading room and look in. Howard Dotson now parks his car there. Honestly, enormously. But things happen in architecture. I'll tell you something. But the idea again was that people could look in and see what the building was about, see people studying, see people, and so the idea of the shortcut was to encourage people to take the shortcut, be right up against the building, and look down and see what was going on. So I think that that and the other thing, to try to find places in every building that people can change and modify to suit their needs. So when I mentioned the Langston Hughes library, this sort of reading area along the way, all the furniture there is loose furniture. There's some tables and some chairs, and so people can sit and set it up for themselves and sort of look out on to the street. So it's the idea of one, transparency, but also giving people a chance to create their own home, their own place within every building, and that's something that architects, and particularly modern architecture, has resisted. The idea of space that's a little bit vague, and that people are allowed to change and shape themselves. And obviously you can make the reference to jazz, where you set up a structure and then each of the people. And I think it's an important point then to go back to this issue of power. Jazz, in that structure, really gives a certain amount of power to every musician. Everybody can express him or herself. And so what architecture does not do, typically, is allow the people who use the building to shape it and to express them. And I think that would be really something that is worthy of a great deal more exploration.
It's fascinating. We have a question here.
Any view of a Max Bond architect and Max Bond citizen, or also touch on the public service you gave to the city. Could you give us a little insight into your years in leadership at the City Planning Commission?
The question was about insight about his years on the City Planning Commission.
First of all, let me just say thank you, Bob. As you see, I've done a lot of things. I've practiced, I've taught, I've been on the City Planning Commission. I think it's all that's been important to me because I think that architecture is such a public profession, and so it's important to be involved in your community. And one of the reasons I've done it as well is that I think I consider myself incredibly lucky because I wouldn't be here without the civil rights movement, without the changes that took place as part of that. And so if you do that, if you've been that lucky, then you owe something back to society, and so you have to be, I think, an active participant in your world and in your society. And so I've tried to do that through not only practicing, but through teaching and through the planning, some public service. The Planning Commission was wonderful because, well, there's this history. I have to tell this story. When I was at the Architecture Renewal Committee in Harlem, there had never been a black member of the New York City Planning Commission or a Latino member. So we decided at Arch that we would change that. So we were working with an organization in East Harlem called the Real Great Society. I don't know if you know, it was a Latino organization. And so we decided that Harry Quintana was going to be our first member of the New York City Planning Commission. So we went down and we held a meeting on the steps of City Hall before 11 o'clock, because you had to do it then before 11 o'clock if you want to make the evening news. And we had a black minister who was very, very, very powerful speaker, and we swore Harry Quintana in as the member of the City Planning Commission. And of course, it was theater. We made the news, and then Harry started attending the meetings of the City Planning Commission. And he'd go up and sit down, and they'd very politely remove him from each session. And so then someone in the Lindsay administration called and offered me or somebody else at Arch a position on the City Planning Commission. But instead, we all had worked together and we recommended Ivan Michael, who was one of Basil Patterson's partners, and he became then the first member of color of the City Planning Commission. And then Gordon Davis served, and then I eventually did serve on the Planning Commission. So there was a little bit of history to that, and it was a great sort of moment. But being on the Planning Commission was really terrific, and again, a very much of a learning experience in the respect that about affordable housing. It was really interesting. There were various limits on the various programs, 221D3, they all had these numbers and names. And every housing development that was subsidized always came in with the maximum budget under each of those, whatever program it was under. And it didn't matter whether the rooms were 8 feet, whether the apartment was 8 feet, it was as big as this table, or as big as this room, they all claimed that they cost the maximum subsidy that was available under that program. So one of the things we had to try to do was to really sort out what was real, what was not in terms of the subsidy and the program. But it was also important that it gave some real sense of the city. One of the things, Ed Koch was mayor at that time, and one of the things I have to say about it was that we were on the Planning Commission, never leaned on. None of the commissioners were ever told how to vote, or even suggested how to vote, despite the reputation that his administration may have. They never they really let us be independent in making our judgments. It was also an interesting moment and a terrific learning experience in just another sense. I realized the importance of the Landmarks Commission and preservation, because without the Landmarks Commission, without the preservation movement, I think so many of the great buildings and even buildings in Harlem would just disappear. So I think that as a kind of urban preservation group, the Landmarks Commission is very important, and they were very, during that time, Herb Sturz was the chair of the Planning Commission, and they worked very closely together. I don't know if that
We have time for one more question. Do you have a question, Greg?
Yes. Try to make this quick. Two related questions, and I'll try to be quick.
I'll try to give a quick answer.
I've been honored to know you for a number of years, you and Jean. And I know about your work on the Harvard Club because at the time, around the time of 9/11, I actually, matter of fact, on 9/11, I was having breakfast at the Harvard Club with executive director of an organization called Associated Black Charities. So I'll always remember that. But I remember having been there that they talked about the work that you were doing. And it was very controversial at the time. So I'd like you to speak briefly about that controversy for the record. And secondly, I'd like you to talk about the work that you and your firms is doing downtown and how that work reflects the architectural principles that you've shared with us tonight.
Okay, on the Harvard Club, it was controversial at the time because obviously there were people who wanted the building to look like the original Harvard Club buildings by McKinley and White. As I said, we just felt that was inappropriate. One, because you really couldn't imitate them. And one of the really interesting things, they held a big public meeting, and a group that opposed our design. I should say about our design, first of all, that we had won a competition. They had shortlisted a group of firms, 5 firms. They'd asked us to do designs for the facade, and we won a competition managed by the club, so that we had won this competition, we then did the design. So they had this group at this big public hearing where they presented, who did an alternative design. They hired some people to do an alternative design, and they tried to copy the existing building. But it was so bad that when they took a vote later, not at that meeting, it was clear that it was better not to try to imitate it. We had the absolute support of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and we had a unanimous support from the Preservation Committee of the community board, of that community board, because everybody who was really involved in preservation felt that it would demean the existing buildings to try to imitate them, and several architects, Harry Cobb and of IMP, Cobb Fried, and others were very supportive in trying to articulate this idea to the members of the club. But as I said before, there were not only aesthetic reasons for not doing it, but there were also reasons of expressing that the club had changed. And again, it goes to this question that Richard mentioned about openness. The new facade, much more open. We do have shutters, and they showed in that picture. You can close the rooms if you need be, but again, to give this greater sense of transparency that the club is more part of the city and not this exclusive enclave. On the World Trade Center, those of us working on the memorial, have been asked not to discuss it publicly. So I'm sorry I can't. That's perfectly all right. But it's, there have been some recent public announcements about it, and I think they've been largely very true. The design is going very well, but I can't say anything more than been said in the public.
Okay. At this moment, before I ask my ultimate question of Mr. Bond, I'd like, first of all, to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to urge you to come back. I'd like to urge you to come back and bring at least one person with you. I'd like to urge you to, actually no, I'm not going to, because that would be probably in bad taste. And I'm not going to tell you to visit our website and donate some money there, because I don't like the kind of people that do that. And so we will define ourselves, don't go to jazzmuseuminharlem.org and look at the fundraising page there, because that would just be tagging me to mention that. Having said that, having said that, but I would like to, what we're doing here is very important for us. And last week's guest, 2 weeks ago, our previous guest is here, and he's the musical director from the Schoenberg Center, actually the artist in residence, and also just a guy who's appeared on more great jazz records than you can shake a stick at, if that's your idea of a good time. And that is the wonderful Mr. Larry Ridley is here. And coming up in 2 weeks, when we take one of our postcards, we're having Willie Mack and Johnny Johnson from the New Amsterdam Musical Association. This is a group that's been going in Harlem for about 100 years. They have a brownstone, I think it's on West 130th Street, where they have jam sessions. I've gone and played there. A lot of people go in there and sit in. And they're going to be here in a couple of weeks. And then we have Joey Morant coming up, Harlem legend, jazz trumpet player, coming up 2 weeks after that. And then the next group will just take off from there. My last question to you, Max, is what do you hope for Harlem? Architectural, from an architectural vantage point, or from any vantage point?
Well, I hope that architecturally, that in fact a lot of the buildings are preserved, and I think Harlem has some wonderful buildings. I hope that they are preserved, and that there's some way to counter the incredible wave of real estate speculation that I think is going to sweep over Harlem, or is already sweeping over Harlem, and that the buildings that are built, because I do think there should be new buildings, are buildings of quality and that represent something about our period and our time. I also hope that Harlem becomes a more economically and culturally diverse community. I think that that's what cities are all about, and you see that happening. I think it's just wonderful to see what's happening in West Harlem with the sort of African communities coming and the impact that they're having. And so I think that to some degree every city should be a place where new people can come and find their place. One thing I did want to say just in closing is that for me this has been a great honor to appear here, but also a great learning experience. I know I've talked a lot, but in trying to think about some of these things, it's been a terrific learning experience for me. And in trying to, one of the things that I was really thinking about and puzzled about was why, as I said, for my generation, the jazz musicians were such heroes in terms of the struggle, heroes in terms of culture, and by trying to talk about it, I've gotten a little clearer in my own mind about that. One, because I think they helped to give people like me an identity. And two, what I said a few minutes ago about jazz as a music that really gives each of the musicians a chance to express him or herself.
Thank you. All I can say in closing is, on behalf of Wilhelmina and Greg and Len Garment and myself, we're honored to have Max Bond as a member of our Jazz Museum family. We'd like to present you with our plaque.
That's all right. Lauren, right here. Here we go, Mike. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And there's more food in the back.